Hey guys, so this is what we're looking at here today. This is a picture of me as a little kid with blonde hair and my mom with dark hair. And I'm gonna argue that this is basically equivalent to this. I do not believe that this argument has been made before. I think we've got some good evidence for it. I hope you find it interesting. So we come up to the top here. The title is Childhood Blondness Compared to Primate Natal Coats, a Conserved Developmental Pigmentation Hypothesis. So here my mom and I are in a tree, we're picking fruit, and you can see that her hair is relatively dark and my hair is light. My hair is no longer light. In the same way that this guy's hair is no longer light, right? So he's only blonde like that from a very young age, and then his fur darkens. This occurs in a large number of different primates, and these are called natal coats, Natal. I was looking at some old pictures with my mom a couple weeks ago over Mother's Day, and I saw this picture, and it clicked in my head. I said, okay, that's a natal coat. So let's see what you think. So a large number of primates have these natal coats. Here are just a couple examples, and you see it in a baboon, in gibbons, which are very closely related to us, in langurs, and other monkeys. There's dozens and dozens of them. So they all lose their natal coat as they get older. And humans lose their blonde hair as they get older. So here we see that one forensic genetic study found that 70.8% of human children who were blonde in early childhood have progressed to brown hair by ages 6 to 13. They actually have those light coats for adaptive reasons. I don't know if it's similarly adaptive in humans or if it's just vestigial. But we know that the KITLG blondness mutation occurred in northern Eurasia 17,000 years ago, and that it leads to blonde hair in many children, but that when puberty hits or even before puberty, that hair tends to darken. And as we continue to move forward, please keep in mind that evolution is incredibly lazy. It rarely invents brand new genetic traits from scratch, and instead, it alters the specifics of existing ones. So here we're going to be talking about this transition that you see from childhood to adulthood. We're going to be talking about how this happens. So eumelanin is the pigment and protein associated with dark hair. And hair color in general. Now there's another pigment called pheomelanin, and that's responsible for all the red hues, such as red hair or strawberry hair. But eumelanin is responsible for the others. So if you have a lot of eumelanin in your hair shaft, then you're gonna have black hair. If you have a medium amount of eumelanin, you have brown hair. And if you have just a small amount of eumelanin, you have blonde hair. And if you don't have any at all, you have white hair, or like we see in older people with gray hair. So the melanocytes produce the melanin. It's transferred to the keratinocytes, which build the hair shaft from keratin. Here's some of the genes responsible. This graph shows that melanin increases with age. You see natal coats in primates, but you also see natal coats, interestingly, in other mammals as well. And we will talk about that. Okay, so another thing I want to point out is that if only scalp hair were involved, childhood blondness could be treated as a narrow human trait shaped by the unusual visibility and social importance of head hair. But that's not the case, right? For little blonde kids, it's not just that the hair on their head is blonde, but the hair all over their body is blonde. So when light pigmentation appears across multiple hair-bearing regions, then that then darken with age, the pattern begins to resemble a whole-body juvenile coloration program that I think is basically equivalent to this. Okay, so not only do we have the KITLG gene involved in European blondness, but we have other examples of blondness as well outside of Europeans. So one is the Solomon Islander case. And here we have the TYRP1 gene that shows up in the Solomon Islands, and it seems to be responsible for the genetic basis of their blonde hair. So again, these kids start with blonde hair, and that blonde hair almost always darkens. Very few of the adults are blonde. And again, this is very similar to what we see with the primate natal coats. So I believe that the Solomon Islander case partially strengthens the hypothesis because it shows that childhood or juvenile biased light hair is not limited to European populations, to people with light skin, or to the genetic variants most often associated with European blondness. So the Solomon Islander example makes the hypothesis more plausible by showing that different human populations can reach similar juvenile light hair phenotypes through different molecular pathways acting on the same ancient primate pigmentation system. So then, in addition to European and Solomon Islander blondness, we also have Aboriginal Australian desert blondness, especially in the Kaidilt area. You have many infants and children with blonde hair, and that blonde hair tends to persist into puberty in the same kind of way. And it's thought that it's possibly different from genetically from the Solomon Islander blondness. And some of these kids have platinum blonde hair. Okay, yet another concept is you see a lot of mixed kids with blonde hair. So anecdotally, I've seen many children who are half African American and half European with blonde curly hair. And this happens in some cases even when the white parents have brown hair and not blonde hair. So I have friends with this pattern. I have friends with children in this pattern. And I even have both a male and a female cousin who have mixed black and white children, and 3 out of 4 of those kids are blonde. So it makes me think that the African genetics, which is shared because all humans come from black people, seems to tolerate blondness and allows it to be incorporated into the phenotype because some ancestral humans were blonde in the ancient past, and thus our African genetic system is compatible with this pattern. So regardless, the fact that mixed children can easily be blonde implies that this natal coat program is latent in Africans and not just in Europeans and Oceanians. So again, here are some different monkeys that show natal coats. And here is a more detailed list that shows primates with natal coats, and these include howlers, spider monkeys, marmosets, capuchins, tamarins, colobus, macaques, baboons, langurs, leaf monkeys, gibbons, and even lorises and lemurs and tarsiers. So that is a lot of different primates. So primate natal coats have attracted the attention of researchers because they're conspicuous. And in many animals, vulnerable infants are expected to be cryptic or camouflaged. But here these infants are not. And they're more visually striking. So there must be an adaptive explanation for this costly adaptation. And researchers have looked into this. A recent phylogenetic analysis of 286 primate species found a strong association between distinctive natal coats and infanticide risk. The coloration reduces the violence and aggression directed at the young. The authors suggest that conspicuous natal coats may help elicit greater maternal care, potentially helping infants move more quickly through a vulnerable stage. So basically, that blonde coat that you see and these primates at a young age says, hey, I'm a newborn or I'm a very young infant. Attend to me, tolerate me, protect me, carry me. Don't treat me as an ordinary juvenile. And then that darkening begins as the animal moves toward greater independence and a more mature social category. So as you can see in the graphic and also the table below, natal coats even take form, not just in monkeys, but across apes, which are much more closely related to us. Chimp young have light facial skin and a white rump tuft. Gorillas also have this white rump tuft. In chimpanzees, it disappears by age 4 or 5, and around age 4, and in gorillas, it's around age 4 or 5. And in orangutans, you see that the young have lighter fur and that it darkens with age. And again, as with the monkeys, in apes, this light color seems to advertise immaturity and elicit tolerance from other group members. So when you see it in gorillas and chimpanzees, this is a gorilla and this is a chimp, it's called a pygal tail tuft. And it seems to be a specific localized version of the natal coat. And we know that through comparative anatomy, evolutionary homology, shared ancestry, identical developmental timelines, evolutionary genetics, identical social functions, and behavioral biology. But it's never been considered before that the blonde hair that we see in humans could be also an example of a natal coat. In monkeys, the natal coat lasts weeks or months because their infancy is short and their social risks are immediate. But in apes and humans, childhood is prolonged and maturity and puberty are delayed. So it makes sense that they hold on to this lighter color for longer. So again, in a lot of monkeys, this natal coat lasts months. In apes, it lasts years. 3, 4, 5 years. And in humans, it's 6 to 15 years. Okay, so I think it's kind of fascinating that many bonobos, which are the pygmy chimpanzees, retain their white rump tuft for life. So this is thought to be an example of neoteny or self-domestication. And I think it's analogous to human adult blondness and implies that human adult blondness also stems from natal coats. So we see bonobos with these white tail tufts that, and only in some bonobos, but it's a large number of them. It's a large proportion of them, the adults. They retain those throughout life. And the fact that some humans remain blonde throughout life, I think is basically very similar to that. So let's take a quick look at this evolutionary tree, and we see how closely related humans are to chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans. Our DNA is 99% identical to chimps, and we're removed by them by around 6 million years of evolution. Our DNA is 96% identical to gibbons, and we share a common ancestor with them 17 million years ago. So I point this out to show that when you have species that are so closely related and they all seem to have natal coats, then that's probably what it is. It's probably, when it shows up in humans, it's probably a natal coat. And I think it's worth pointing out that my brother and I both had blonde hair, but now we both have dark hair like our mother and father. Okay, so next we're going to ask, how could this hypothesis be tested? And it's actually a pretty simple test. The critical experiment would be to sample hair follicles at several stages of the color transition in humans and primates. So you would take samples from little blonde kids whose hair is darkening, and you would take samples from monkeys and apes whose natal coats are darkening. And you would try to see if the same proteins and genes were involved, right? So you'd want to look at the follicular pigmentary unit, you'd want to look at the melanocytes, the melanosomes, the keratinocytes, the dermal papilla cells, but mostly you'd want to look at what genes and proteins were being used to make these changes, right? And to do that, you could look at single cell RNA sequencing or spatial transcriptomics. And for the most part, the genes of interest would be these here in bold. So if a pale natal coat darkens because these pathways become more active, then the comparison to human childhood hair darkening becomes much stronger. So if this hypothesis is correct, then we'd expect to see the same genes involved in the human samples and in the primate samples, and that the timing of the expression of these genes would match more or less. And here's a little bit more information about how we could test this in that way. So if these gene pathways overlap strongly with human blondness and age-related hair darkening genes, then the hypothesis is strengthened. It would suggest that human blondness is not merely a recent cosmetic anomaly and may be produced by the same ancient developmental pigmentation machinery that in other primates can produce natal coats. So we talked about the fact that some bonobos retain their white rump patch into adulthood and throughout life. And this is a concept called heterochrony. And because it seems like the retention of juvenile traits, which bonobos show many examples of, this involves neoteny and paedomorphosis. But not only do bonobos retain their rump patch for life, but many gibbons do as well. And of course, there are different species of gibbons, but several of them do this. So in white-cheeked gibbons, all infants are born light or blonde, then turn black at around 1 to 5 years of age. And then females later undergo a second color change between roughly 5 and 9 years, returning to a light or blonde adult pelage while the males remain black. So here you have sexual dimorphism in their blondness. And fascinatingly, you also have sexual dimorphism in human blondness. Women are twice as likely to be blonde as men, and their blondness darkens more slowly with age. So relative to bonobos and gibbons, adult blondness can be interpreted as a partial retention of the juvenile light state. Okay, so where did we get these genes from, and what was the earliest blonde human ancestor? Well, humans are catarrhine primates in the sense that we belong to the group of old world monkeys and apes, the last common ancestor of which lived 25 to 30 million years ago. Every major lineage descended from those ancestors shows some form of developmentally regulated pigmentation change across early life. But if you look at New World monkeys, they also tend to have natal coats, although not quite as frequently. So this pushes that date back to 35 to 40 million years ago. So this distribution is not consistent with independent invention across each lineage. It's consistent with a shared developmental architecture, the hormonal and follicular machinery linking maturational state to pigment output that was already present in the anthropoid common ancestor roughly 35 to 40 million years ago and has been differentially expressed, amplified, or attenuated in descendant lineages ever since. So what was ancestral on this account was not necessarily a visually dramatic natal coat, but the underlying machinery. Melanocyte sensitivity to hormonal state, follicle level regulation of eumelanin output across developmental time, and the capacity for pigmentation to shift as the animal moves from dependency towards maturity. So human blondness is usually discussed as a recent adaptation, a regional trait, or a matter of sexual selection. But I argue here that blondness did not need to originate from nothing, as the current literature seems to presume. I asked multiple AI language models to go online and spend tens of minutes seeing if anyone had ever mentioned this connection between human blondness and natal coats. And It just doesn't exist. So the current literature doesn't recognize this at all. But I think it's a good hypothesis. It's clearly testable. And if the natal code hypothesis is correct, it could improve forensic hair color prediction, inform the biology of hair darkening and graying, clarify the evolutionary relationship between human pigmentation and primate infant signals, and provide a concrete molecular test of whether modern human variation can reveal ancient developmental architecture. So again, if this interpretation is correct, then childhood blondness is more than a human curiosity. It may reveal how recent human variation can act through ancient developmental systems, and how traits that seem culturally familiar can still carry deep evolutionary history. Okay, guys, thank you for tuning in.